This is Shadows of Life, and today we bring you the case of the Galapagos Affair. Act 1, The Lava Desert and the Nietzsche Philosopher. The Pacific is not an invitation. It is a wall of silence and salt. At the center of that absolute blue, the Galapagos archipelago rises not as a paradise but as a geological wound. Floreana is the cruelest of those wounds. A mass of volcanic rock, black and razor-edged, where fresh water is a miracle and shade is a hallucination. It was to this ash desert that, in August of 1929, a man decided that humanity was finished for him. Friedrich Ritter was not a castaway by accident. He was a castaway by ideology. A physician by training and a devoted disciple of Friedrich Nietzsche by conviction, Ritter saw Weimar Germany as a rotting corpse, a theater of mediocrity and weakness. He was searching for the Übermensch, the overman, but believed this being could only be born in absolute isolation, far from the comfort that atrophies muscle and the morality that rots the will. By his side was Dor Strauch, a former patient who had abandoned her husband in every social convention to follow her prophet into an exile that promised transcendence but would deliver only agony. We know this type in America. Not the philosophical packaging, but the impulse underneath. The man who moves off the grid to a compound in Montana, stockpiles canned food and manifestos, and calls it enlightenment. The charismatic leader who convinces his followers to leave their families and join him somewhere remote where his rules are the only rules. Ritter wore Nietzsche like a costume, but the thing driving him was ancient and American in its logic, the fantasy of the self-made man who needs no one, who escapes society by sheer will, and who builds a kingdom from scratch. The difference is he chose a volcanic island in the middle of the Pacific. And the island did not care about his philosophy. The first impression of Floreana comes through smell. There is no fragrance of tropical flowers, only the metallic odor of dry lava and the thick musk of marine iguanas. For Ritter, this was purity. Before leaving civilization, the two committed an act of visceral, macabre commitment. They had all their teeth pulled and replaced with stainless steel dentures. A cold calculation to avoid infections where there would be no dentists, but also a symbol. They did not want to chew on European culture anymore. They were ready for the iron diet of survival. The construction of Frito, the stone shelter they named after the initials of both their names, was an exercise in voluntary torture. No machines, no help, only sweat that evaporated before it reached the black ground. Ritter, the Berlin intellectual, became a pack animal. Dor, despite the multiple sclerosis already beginning to claim her body, dragged volcanic rocks under a sun that does not forgive. Every bruise was, in Ritter's mind, a medal earned against bourgeois decadence. They slept in holes, ate what the barren earth allowed, and wrote letters to the outside world proclaiming the superiority of ascetic life. Ritter wrote constantly. His philosophical essays, shipped out on occasional supply boats, painted the picture of an intellectual utopia. The European press devoured them. Ritter had become an involuntary celebrity, which was a delicious irony. The man who renounced civilization was now its favorite entertainment. Every story published about the philosopher of Galapagos drew new curious visitors to his forbidden paradise, and with the visitors came the boats, and with the boats came the civilization he despised most, knocking on his stone door with cameras and tourist smiles. But the reality inside the lava walls of Frito was one of growing resentment. The silence Ritter so desperately wanted became a weight on Dor. Nature was not being tamed, it was watching, waiting for the first sign of weakness. And the signal would come not from the earth but from the horizon. The isolation, the only currency of value for Ritter, was about to be devalued by the arrival of the other. Hell, as Sartre would say, was coming by boat. Act 2, The Invasion of the Ordinary. The year was 1932. The myth of Ritter, the modern Robinson Crusoe, had spread across European newspapers. What he intended as an act of repudiation of society had become, ironically, a magnet for the curious and the desperate. For Ritter, the sight of a ship on the horizon was not a rescue signal. It was a desecration. And the desecration had a name, the Wittmer family. Heinz Wittmer, his wife Margaret, and young Harry were not philosophers. They were the exact opposite. Heinz was a civil servant from Cologne, a practical man looking for the island to cure his son's fragile health and provide an escape from Germany's economic instability. They brought tools, seeds, and above all, the middle-class mindset Ritter so despised. They did not want to transcend humanity. They wanted a garden, a clean house, and peace. Americans understand this family immediately. They are the people who show up in every frontier story, not the visionary, not the dreamer, but the ones who actually build something. The couple that packs up a U-Haul and moves somewhere hard because it makes sense for the family. The ones who figure it out with their hands. Ritter had spent years theorizing about the superior human being, and here came living proof that the superior human being just needed a shovel and common sense. That was the insult he could not survive. The arrival of the Wittmers cracked Floreana's fragile unity. Ritter received them not with the fraternity of a pioneer but with the arrogance of a dethroned monarch. To the philosopher, the Wittmers were second-rate bourgeoisie dragging the garbage of civilization into his lava temple. He refused to help them find water. He left them to fend for themselves in the damp caves of Black Beach, expecting the environment to drive them out. But the Wittmers had something Ritter lacked: pragmatic resilience. While he lost himself in abstractions about the will to power, Heinz and Margaret dug the soil with their bare hands, learned the cycles of rare rains, and turned pirate caves into livable homes. Their presence was a constant reminder of Ritter's failure. If an ordinary family could survive here, then his heroic sacrifice was just a pathetic eccentricity. The hatred in Floreana began to ferment like something left in the heat too long. The exchanges of correspondence between the two houses, situated kilometers apart but linked by invisible paranoia, grew short and toxic. Margaret Wittmer, pregnant and battling nausea in a climate where even the air felt like ground glass, began to see in Ritter not a genius but an unstable tyrant. Dor, for her part, saw in the Wittmers the life she had abandoned and was secretly beginning to want back: the comfort of simple conversation, the warmth of a family. There was something deeply humiliating in the forced coexistence of the two groups. Ritter had built his entire identity on the premise that ordinary life was a form of slow death, and here was ordinary life, planting potatoes and surviving just fine, a few kilometers from his failed utopia. Heinz Wittmer did not need Nietzsche. He needed a hoe and common sense. And it worked. Every time Ritter saw smoke rising from the Wittmer cabin at dusk, the signal of food on the fire and a family simply existing without needing to justify itself in philosophical terms, something in him corroded like old metal in the rain. The island, once a laboratory of philosophy, was becoming a psychological chessboard. Ritter and the Wittmers avoided each other but watched each other constantly. Every new planting, every hunted animal, was a provocation. Water scarcity turned the springs into Cold War zones. German courtesy was maintained only by the thin film of necessity, but underneath, the dehumanization of the neighbor was total. But this binary conflict between the intellectual and the practical man was about to be obliterated by an external force neither of them had anticipated. A force that brought neither tools nor philosophy, but weapons, silk, and a will to dominate that would make Ritter's ego look infantile. On the horizon, a new sail was rising. And with it, the Baroness. Floreana would no longer be an island of survivors. It would become a stage for blood. Act 3, The Arrival of the Baroness and the Chaos Triangle. The horizon of Floreana, which until then had been the private domain of a philosopher and the construction site of a German family, was cut by the silhouette of a luxury yacht. Not a supply vessel, not a local fishing canoe. It was the materialization of excess in the shape of hull and sail. In October of 1932, the woman who would seal the island's tragic fate stepped onto the black sand beach, the Baroness Eloise von Wagner-Bosket. She did not come alone. Behind her, like shadows or extensions of her own will, were her two lovers, Robert Philipson and Rudolf Lorenz. The Baroness was not an aristocrat in any traditional sense. She was a master of performance. With a revolver on her hip, a riding crop in her hand, and wearing silk trousers that scandalized the era's puritanism, she claimed Floreana as her personal fiefdom. Her goal was bizarre and ambitious: build the Hacienda Paradiso, a luxury hotel for millionaires crossing the Panama Canal. Where Ritter saw a sanctuary of isolation and the Wittmers saw a subsistence farm, the Baroness saw a stage for her own narcissism. In America we recognize this archetype immediately, though we usually find it in a boardroom or a reality TV show. The person who walks into an existing situation, claims authority they were never given, rewrites the rules for their own benefit, and punishes anyone who pushes back. The difference is that in most contexts, there is a legal structure, a social framework, some external check on that behavior. On Floreana, there was nothing. The Pacific Ocean was the only law, and it was indifferent. The dynamic in Floreana shifted instantaneously from silent discomfort to a state of siege. The Baroness did not request space, she took it. She intercepted her neighbor's mail, stole the few supplies arriving on boats from Guayaquil, and spread malicious stories to the international press, presenting herself as the one true Empress of Floreana. The love triangle she maintained with Philipson and Lorenz was a constant source of physical tension. Philipson was the favorite, the strong arm used to intimidate Ritter and the Wittmers. Lorenz, on the other hand, was quickly reduced to the status of a domestic slave, frequently humiliated and physically assaulted by the other two in front of the neighbors. The moral horror here does not reside only in the Baroness's tyranny but in everyone else's reaction to it. Friedrich Ritter, the man who preached the transcendence of ordinary humanity, found himself powerless. His Nietzschean rhetoric collapsed before the vulgarity of a woman who respected none of his intellectual rules. He wrote in his diary that the Baroness was a prostitute of the apocalypse, but in face-to-face encounters, the once lofty physician trembled with contained rage. The civilization they had tried to leave behind returned in its most grotesque form, the fascism of a self-proclaimed little queen on a throne of ashes. Coexistence became impossible. The Baroness began declaring that the island's few water sources were her private property. In an environment where every drop of sweat counts, control of water is control of life. She walked the island with her riding crop, insulting the Wittmers and treating Dor Strauch with a contempt that edged toward sadism. The island of Floreana, surrounded by thousands of kilometers of ocean, had become too small for the 7 souls inhabiting it. The air was saturated with the smell of sulfur and the sound of screams swallowed by extinct craters. There was one aspect of Floreana that none of the colonists had calculated when they set out for exile: the physical weight of hatred. Not the abstract hatred of philosophy, not the class hatred described in political pamphlets, but the concrete, visceral hatred that takes up space in the chest like a block of basalt. When you live 100 meters from someone who wants you dead, when every dawn brings the sound of enemy footsteps on the lava and every dusk carries the risk of an ambush, the human organism switches into permanent war mode. Cortisol spikes. Sleep fragments. Perception warps. The colonists of Floreana were no longer sleeping, they were merely losing consciousness for a few hours before returning to the predatory alert state. Rudolf Lorenz was the living thermometer of this degradation. Each new bruise on his face indicated that the island's temperature had risen another degree. The Wittmers watched him arrive at their door with expressions that mixed pity and revulsion: pity for the destroyed human in front of them, revulsion because sheltering him meant declaring open war on the Baroness. Floreana would no longer be an island of survivors. It would become a stage for blood. Act 3, The Arrival of the Baroness and the Chaos Triangle. The horizon of Floreana, which until then had been the private domain of a philosopher and the construction site of a German family, was cut by the silhouette of a luxury yacht. Not a supply vessel, not a local fishing canoe. It was the materialization of excess in the shape of hull and sail. In October of 1932, the woman who would seal the island's tragic fate stepped onto the black sand beach, the Baroness Eloise von Wagner-Bosket. She did not come alone. Behind her, like shadows or extensions of her own will, were her two lovers, Robert Philipson and Rudolf Lorenz. The Baroness was not an aristocrat in any traditional sense. She was a master of performance. With a revolver on her hip, a riding crop in her hand, and wearing silk trousers that scandalized the era's puritanism, she claimed Floreana as her personal fiefdom. Her goal was bizarre and ambitious: build the Hacienda Paradiso, a luxury hotel for millionaires crossing the Panama Canal. Where Ritter saw a sanctuary of isolation and the Wittmers saw a subsistence farm, the Baroness saw a stage for her own narcissism. In America we recognize this archetype immediately, though we usually find it in a boardroom or a reality TV show. The person who walks into an existing situation, claims authority they were never given, rewrites the rules for their own benefit, and punishes anyone who pushes back. The difference is that in most contexts, there is a legal structure, a social framework, some external check on that behavior. On Floreana, there was nothing. The Pacific Ocean was the only law, and it was indifferent. The dynamic in Floreana shifted instantaneously from silent discomfort to a state of siege. The Baroness did not request space, she took it. She intercepted her neighbor's mail, stole the few supplies arriving on boats from Guayaquil, and spread malicious stories to the international press, presenting herself as the one true Empress of Floreana. The love triangle she maintained with Philipson and Lorenz was a constant source of physical tension. Philipson was the favorite, the strong arm used to intimidate Ritter and the Wittmers. Lorenz, on the other hand, was quickly reduced to the status of a domestic slave, frequently humiliated and physically assaulted by the other two in front of the neighbors. The moral horror here does not reside only in the Baroness's tyranny but in everyone else's reaction to it. Friedrich Ritter, the man who preached the transcendence of ordinary humanity, found himself powerless. His Nietzschean rhetoric collapsed before the vulgarity of a woman who respected none of his intellectual rules. He wrote in his diary that the Baroness was a prostitute of the apocalypse, but in face-to-face encounters, the once lofty physician trembled with contained rage. The civilization they had tried to leave behind returned in its most grotesque form, the fascism of a self-proclaimed little queen on a throne of ashes. Coexistence became impossible. The Baroness began declaring that the island's few water sources were her private property. In an environment where every drop of sweat counts, control of water is control of life. She walked the island with her riding crop, insulting the Wittmers and treating Dor Strauch with a contempt that edged toward sadism. The island of Floreana, surrounded by thousands of kilometers of ocean, had become too small for the 7 souls inhabiting it. The air was saturated with the smell of sulfur and the sound of screams swallowed by extinct craters. There was one aspect of Floreana that none of the colonists had calculated when they set out for exile: the physical weight of hatred. Not the abstract hatred of philosophy, not the class hatred described in political pamphlets, but the concrete, visceral hatred that takes up space in the chest like a block of basalt. When you live 100 meters from someone who wants you dead, when every dawn brings the sound of enemy footsteps on the lava and every dusk carries the risk of an ambush, the human organism switches into permanent war mode. Cortisol spikes. Sleep fragments. Perception warps. The colonists of Floreana were no longer sleeping, they were merely losing consciousness for a few hours before returning to the predatory alert state. Rudolf Lorenz was the living thermometer of this degradation. Each new bruise on his face indicated that the island's temperature had risen another degree. The Wittmers watched him arrive at their door with expressions that mixed pity and revulsion, pity for the destroyed human in front of them, revulsion because sheltering him meant declaring open war on the Baroness. Margaret Wittmer would later document in her diaries that Lorenz seemed to age a decade per week. Sunken eyes, cracked lips, hands that trembled not from cold but from chronic terror. He was the mirror of what Floreana did to those who arrived full of dreams and found only black soil and cruelty. Act 4, The Erosion of Sanity and the Climate of War. In 1934, nature decided to intervene in the human horror theater. An unprecedented drought struck the Galapagos. The sky became a scorching zinc dome and the sparse vegetation, already resilient, began to die, turning into dry fuel under the equatorial sun. The scarcity of resources stripped away the last mask of decency the colonists had left. Hunger and thirst do not produce solidarity in isolated communities. They produce predators. This is something Americans have watched play out, just rarely in such a compressed and inescapable form. We've seen it in disaster aftermath, the way Hurricane Katrina peeled back the surface of a city and revealed the social structures underneath, raw and unforgiving. We've seen it in prison documentaries, in survival shows that go wrong, in every story where the removal of social infrastructure reveals what's actually underneath. Floreana was that experiment run without cameras, without rescue teams, without the possibility of cutting to commercial. Rudolf Lorenz became the weakest link and, consequently, the most dangerous. He was frequently seen fleeing to the Wittmers' home, begging for food or protection after being beaten by Philipson. Margaret Wittmer would describe Lorenz as a living skeleton, a man whose spirit had been ground down by the Baroness's cruelty. But on Floreana, pity was a resource as scarce as water. Ritter saw Lorenz as a worm, the Wittmers saw him as a burden. Paranoia became the island's official language. Ritter began surrounding Frito with traps, convinced the Baroness was planning to murder him in his sleep. Communication between the three settlements ceased entirely, except for threats shouted across distances or hate messages left on pieces of wood. The Baroness, desperate over the failure of her Paradise Hotel, which had never progressed beyond a mud and plank shack, began raving about conspiracies. She believed the Germans were poisoning the few animals she owned. The social collapse was total when the Baroness began openly carrying her revolver, firing into the brush at the slightest sound. Malnutrition started affecting everyone's cognitive functions. Vitamin C deficiency and the consumption of bitter roots caused hallucinations and extreme irritability. Friedrich Ritter, the physician who had sought biological perfection, was now reduced to a man who talked to himself among dying plants, cursing the day he believed isolation would set him free. The drought of 1934 was not merely climatic. It was existential. It exposed the foundational lie on which each colonies had built their presence in Floreana. Ritter had promised himself and Dor that isolation would generate fullness, that by severing ties with decadent civilization they would reach a superior form of existence. What the drought revealed was the opposite. Without the external structure of society, without the conventions and institutions he so despised, what remained was only the brutal mechanics of animal survival. There was no Übermensch in Floreana. There were only bodies that needed water. The Wittmers suffered differently. Heinz had brought the family to the island promising health and simplicity. Now he watched his teenage son learn that the world runs on force and deception by observing the Baroness patrol the island with her riding crop. Margaret, who had given birth in a lava cave without medical assistance, who had turned rocks into walls and rain into harvest, saw all her pragmatic effort threatened not by nature but by human madness around her. She did not record despair in her diaries, she recorded facts. And the clinical coldness with which she documented the daily horrors was, in itself, the most disturbing signal that something fundamental had broken inside her too. In this scorched earth scenario, a silent plan began to take shape. There are no records of who took the first step, but the silence between the Wittmers and Ritter became complicit. The Baroness's presence was no longer just an inconvenience, it was a death sentence for everyone else. The dust clouds lifted by Floreana's constant wind seemed to whisper a single word: elimination. The Eden was ready for its first blood sacrifice. What unites people who hate each other? A common threat. Ritter and the Wittmers would never have exchanged a friendly word under normal circumstances. One was the intellectual who despised the mediocrity of the bourgeois family, the others were the bourgeois family who saw a dangerous lunatic in the intellectual. But the Baroness had done something none of them expected. She had converted their mutual antipathy into a tacit alliance. When two enemies start looking in the same direction, it is not because they have become friends. It is because they found a third enemy more urgent than their feud. And in Floreana, in the summer of 1934, that urgency had a painted face, a revolver on her hip, and a riding crop in her hand. Act 5, The Disappearance and the Poisoned Meat. The silence that fell over Floreana in March of 1934 was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a freshly sealed tomb. Baroness Eloise von Wagner-Bosket and her favored lover, Robert Philipson, vanished. No goodbyes, no packed bags, no trail of foam from a departing boat on the horizon. Simply, where there had once been the crack of a riding crop and the hysterical laughter of the Empress, there was now only the hum of flies and the crackle of dead vegetation under the sun. Margaret Wittmer, the keeper of the island's secrets, would later offer a convenient story. The Baroness had suddenly departed on a yacht bound for Tahiti. But there was no yacht. No ship was logged passing through that sector that day. No captain signed a manifest. No fisherman saw them leave. What remained was Rudolf Lorenz, the humiliated lover, who appeared at the Wittmers' door trembling, eyes shot through with a terror that human language fails to describe. He was desperate to leave the island, to flee from something he could not bring himself to name aloud. He sold all of the Baroness's possessions at throwaway prices in a frantic attempt to buy passage away from that cursed ground. The air in Floreana grew heavy, saturated with the suspicion of a crime without a body. Friedrich Ritter, in his final delirium, watched the Baroness's empty house with a mixture of relief and growing dread. If the prostitute of the apocalypse had been eliminated, who would be next in the island's order? The soil of Floreana, composed of volcanic ash that swallows everything, is famous for its ability to conceal what is buried in it. But the human psyche does not possess that drainage mechanism. Ritter's paranoia reached its peak. He, the man who preached the transcendence of Christian morality, now found himself haunted by very secular and very concrete ghosts. Death, however, was not satisfied. It came to claim the philosopher in a manner so ironic it bordered on cosmic sarcasm. In November of 1934, the prolonged drought had decimated the island's livestock. Ritter, the strict vegetarian, the man who believed he had absolute control over his own biology, was forced by hunger to consume chicken meat that had died of botulism. The toxin attacked his nervous system with a surgical precision no philosophy could stop. Dor Strauch's descriptions of Ritter's final hours are a catalogue of clinical horror. The man who wanted to be a god died like an animal chained to its own physical failure. He lost the ability to speak. His muscles, once forged in manual labor against the lava, became useless. His stainless steel dentures, the ultimate symbol of his renunciation of civilization, gleamed macabrely in candlelight while he tried, in vain, to articulate one last curse against Dor, the woman who had served him and who now watched him die with glacial indifference. There are accounts that Ritter, in his last moments of consciousness, wrote with his finger in the dirt floor his final verdict on his companion, accusing her of slow and deliberate poisoning. The Übermensch died in spasms and the smell of rotting meat, leaving behind a trail of philosophical manuscripts no one would read, a woman who pretended to weep, and a void that the Pacific would soon begin to swallow. But there was an even denser layer of horror in that death. Dor Strauch knew, as anyone with basic medical training would know, that meat with the smell and appearance that chicken had should not be consumed. She had been a physician's companion for years. She had learned to identify signs of decomposition long before arriving on the island. The question that investigators and biographers could never definitively answer is simple and brutal: did she know? And if she knew, did she serve it anyway? The paralysis that consumed Ritter would have been slow enough for him to understand, in the darkness of that stone cabin, that the woman he had molded in his image had decided, finally, to sculpt her own exit. Act 6, The Residue of Utopia. The aftermath of Floreana extended far beyond its shores, like an infection spreading through salt water. Rudolf Lorenz, the broken survivor, finally convinced a Norwegian fisherman to take him away from the island. He believed he had escaped the curse. But the Galapagos Sea does not release its prisoners easily. Months later, Lorenz's boat was found grounded on Isla Marchena, an even more desolate lava desert with not a single drop of fresh water on its surface. What investigators found was a vision pulled from a nightmare. Two bodies mummified by sun and salt, sitting side by side against a black rock as if waiting for someone who would never come. One of them was Lorenz. His clothes were in shreds, his skin stretched over his bones like dried ancient parchment. He did not die from wounds but from a thirst so absolute that his internal organs had likely crystallized before his heart stopped. The man who fled a massacre on Floreana ended as a statue of despair on Marchena, a monument to the futility of running. The cruelest irony, Marchena is surrounded by living ocean, abundant in fish and seabirds. There was protein everywhere around them. But fresh water, none. Death did not need weapons. It only needed salt. Later analysis of the mummification suggests that Lorenz and the fishermen survived for weeks drinking the blood of seabirds and attempting to extract fluids from raw fish, a desperate attempt to maintain hydration that only accelerated renal failure from excess proteins and salts. Lorenz died fleeing a ghost, the Baroness, only to be consumed by the same sun that had once illuminated his dreams of fortune in the islands. His death was slow, conscious, and absolutely solitary. There was no Baroness to hate, no Wittmer to beg for help, no philosopher to blame. There was only the heat, the thirst, and the certainty that no one knew where he was. On Floreana, the Wittmers stayed. Margaret Wittmer became the matriarch of the island, the keeper of a silence that would last for decades. She outlived everyone, the Baroness, Ritter, Dorr, and her own husband. Until her death at 95, Margaret maintained a facade of bourgeois normalcy, serving tea to tourists who came in search of the mystery. But her eyes, said those who visited her, never stopped watching the shadows in the bushes. She knew where the Baroness's bones were buried, if there were bones, if there was a grave. She knew whether the meat that killed Ritter had truly been an accident or an act of Dorr Strauch's distorted mercy. And she carried that knowledge the way you carry a lava stone in your chest, heavy, hot, and impossible to expose to sunlight without revealing what lies beneath. Later investigators noted that Margaret possessed personal belongings of the Baroness, jewelry, clothing, documents, that would hardly have been left behind during a sudden trip to Tahiti. When questioned, she would deflect and change the subject with the fluency of someone who had practiced the response for years. Margaret's psychology was that of lineage preservation above all else. In her diaries, the birth of her son in the cave is described with an almost clinical coldness, while the Baroness's disappearance is treated with a suspicious lightness, as if describing the passing of a cloud. To the Wittmers, the Baroness was not a neighbor. She was a biological threat to the existence of their family. And in environments of finite resources, eliminating the competitor is not a crime. It is an evolutionary imperative. The tragedy of Floreana is not merely a historical footnote about eccentric German colonists lost in the Pacific. It is a laboratory analysis of what happens when we remove the support structure of civilization. In isolation, we do not become gods, we become caricatures of our worst impulses. Ritter's experiment proved that the human mind, deprived of social mirrors, collapses into tyranny or madness. The island was not the stage for a new humanity. It was the morgue of an old vanity. The lesson of Floreana cuts across every era and every border. Ritter read Nietzsche and believed philosophy could replace food, water, and human decency. The Baroness believed performance could replace legitimacy. Lorenz believed escape could replace confrontation. Every single one of them was catastrophically wrong, and the island had no mercy for their errors. What Floreana offers us, across nearly a century of distance, is not a cautionary tale about remote islands. It is a mirror. Strip away the structure, remove the referees, cut off the exits, and watch what the civilized person becomes when the pressure is high enough and the stakes are absolute. Today, the lava tunnels of Floreana remain, cold and indifferent. Ritter's letters were consumed by mold and the Baroness's Hacienda Paradiso was reclaimed by brush. What remains is the visceral lesson that hell is not other people, as Sartre said, but the impossibility of escaping yourself in a place where the horizon is infinite and the options are zero. The mystery of the Baroness will never be solved, because the only ones who knew the truth understood that on Floreana, the secret was the only commodity more valuable than water. The ash-eaten is still out there, floating in the void, a graveyard for everyone who believed they could reinvent the human being without first taming the monster that lives in the mirror. Because the monster does not live in the wilderness or in hunger. It lives in the moment you decide that others do not deserve to exist. In Floreana, that moment came for everyone.